delighted to be joined by Cornish Damo and Helen O'Connor, who is an NHS organiser and was a nurse for 20 years. And today's topic is basically the 1% pay rise, they call it, or pay cut in real terms, for all staff working in the NHS. So, Helen, would you like to tell us what's happening in the hospitals that you organise in, please?
Yes, certainly. So what we've seen in the NHS during the period of the pandemic is NHS staff going over and above to look after people, and they've saved thousands of lives. We started the pandemic with a huge recruitment crisis in the NHS. So there was 100,000 vacancies even before the pandemic, and 40,000 of those vacancies are nurse vacancies. So now we have a situation where seriously unwell people with COVID are flooding the hospitals. They're requiring much more care. NHS staff themselves are at high risk of catching COVID-19. Almost 1,000 of them have died already. They've not had adequate PPE, and even up to this day they're still struggling to get the PPE that they need to protect themselves. So the conditions are grueling. Obviously, seriously unwell people require more care. It's labor intensive, it's exhausting. Where they can get the PPE, it's hot and uncomfortable to wear. And I don't think the TV programs really convey just the horror of the conditions that nurses and other NHS staff are enduring at the moment. Many people are dying. They have all the trauma of having to deal with that. Many are suffering with post-traumatic stress disorders. So there's going to be a massive mental health crisis building up within the NHS as well. And now this Tory government has turned around and said that they're only worth 1%, which people have gone now from being exhausted and demoralized to being really furious about this. So what we're seeing is people saying, no way, they're not going to put up with it. So they're now starting to get active in their trade unions. They're starting to join their trade unions. And that's certainly what I would encourage them to do as an NHS trade union organizer for the GMB union. And I'd say, don't just join your union and treat it like an insurance for if you get into trouble at work. Join your union and get active and get other people around you to join the union and have branch meetings and discuss your pay terms and conditions, because it's really, really important now that they fight back, because the NHS is nothing without its staff. And this 1%, let's make no mistake about it, this 1% is part of a Tory party strategy to demoralise NHS staff and make them leave. We need to be really clear about that. And then if you think about the impact for the patients, because the NHS staff are so critical to patient care, and things are already getting dangerous on the wards and in the communities because there's so few experienced staff. And if you go into hospital as a patient, believe me, you really do need experienced staff looking after you, because if people don't know what they're doing, patients get injured, patients even die. So it's a very, very serious situation in the NHS. So the staff, we need to retain the staff. When the staff leave, the service will fail. Then the risk is the service will be privatised. And we've already seen as well that the amount of services available in the NHS are getting less. For example, there's various operations you now can't have on the NHS anymore. You have to pay if you want those operations. So the removal of varicose veins is just one tiny example. So basically, we're rapidly moving to a situation in this country where all the good experienced NHS staff are being deliberately demoralised. They're going to end up leaving. The private sector will come in. The patients will end up having to pay for care. And if you can't pay for your care, you'll get no care. And as a patient, you'll be sat at home in pain, having difficulty in breathing, and you'll have nowhere to go. And I can tell you already in Croydon, where I live, you can no longer directly go to A&E anymore. You have to ring up a number. And I know that local people are having difficulties even getting through to that number. So you can imagine, you can see right there that the services are already being restricted for patients. So it's very serious.
It's a perfect storm, isn't it? And we've seen, for years and years under Tory government for the last 11 years, we've seen attack after attack on all of our public sector workforce. To go out on an all-out attack on nurses who are at the very front line of this crisis, it doesn't bear thinking about, does it? I mean, we all owe lives to fabulous staff in the NHS, and when you decide you want to be a nurse, Helen, I mean, you've been there, you'll know. I would imagine that you're not expecting to walk into a effective war zone, or to risk your life or your family's lives either. So the emotional trauma and distress that must be causing would be something altogether. I mean, my only experience of the NHS is as a patient, but certainly if I was ever considering going to retrain for a new job, I would be very worried about going into the wards and so on. Imo, what's been your experience inside the NHS?
So I always thought, I started in the NHS in 1990, and I always believed after doing all that training that I would retire in the NHS. That was genuinely what I wanted to do. And yes, it is a difficult job. So many students actually drop off the course because the course is really, really difficult to get through. So when I qualified, I thought, yeah, you know, I was really, really lucky. I got to do some really interesting jobs in the NHS. So I was quite lucky. And like I said, I started out with pay that I could live on. The pay wasn't too bad. But then after years of 0% pay freezes and 1%, what I found was I was struggling to get by on my pay, and it was really serious. And the other thing I experienced in the NHS was restructure after restructure. And what that did was that, for example, when I was a psychiatric nurse, they said they were going to restructure the whole service and downband us. So obviously we struggled against that, and we stopped that happening within the trade unions, but that was happening right throughout. And the skill mix, the number of experienced staff were being driven down in the services, or the services were being reconfigured so they were less accessible for patients. So all that was going on around me, alongside cuts in the benefit system. Social housing was becoming increasingly inaccessible as well. So it got to a point where you couldn't get the basic things for people that they needed to be healthy, like money and housing, you know, the building blocks for human health. So it was like just a complete perfect storm. And it was really demoralizing as a nurse in the NHS not to be able to access the things that people needed to keep them healthy and keep them well. So yeah, so there are kind of some of the reasons that I left the NHS, but I thought I'd retire in the NHS. That's what I wanted to do. So it's one of the things that makes me feel really sad in my life that I wasn't able to do that. And that's when I came over to become more involved in the union movement as a rep. So I tried to organize my fellow colleagues into my union to try and fight against some of the restructures. So we had some successes, but also, you know, there were some things we couldn't push back, you know, but we did try and push back that tide of cuts and privatisation that were kind of coming in hard and fast, really, since about 2008, after the financial crash.
So given the massive increase in the cost of living, particularly, I mean, you're in London, I'm in London, how far away are nurses having to live from where they're working? Do they still get, you know, when the local hospital to me was built, a lot of the nursing staff came from the council estate that was built around the hospitals, and I know that those places, you know, a lot of them have been sold off under right to buy and so on, and that nurses are having to travel further afield. I read some reports recently about a lot of other public sector workers having to travel from, you know, well outside of London to come into work. What sort of distances are the nurses that you represent covering?
Well, I did it myself when I was in the NHS. I had a long commute for 2 hours at one point into my job. So yeah, so what you find is the accommodation closer to the hospitals becomes unaffordable. So at one point there was an effort to have some key worker accommodation because they recognised the problem was really serious, and that NHS, the lower paid NHS staff, including the nurses, were struggling, you know, to actually get into work. And when you're doing shifts as well, you can imagine there's even more pressure, isn't there, to kind of find transport to get you in at night, and you know, if you don't drive or whatever, so it can become really, really difficult. But yeah, nurses and other health workers are struggling with all of those costs that everyone else is struggling with, and increasingly the wages across all the bands actually can't keep up with the cost of living, particularly in London. It's very, very difficult, and that's the reason that people are leaving. They're thinking, hang on a minute, I've got all this experience, I've studied to degree level, and you know, I cannot afford to live on my wages. I think it's one of the only jobs, you know, you'd ever be in where your wages would actually go down the more experience you get. And very recently I've come across a nurse in St. George's Hospital actually, who was a band 6. She went off and did a 3-month extra course, and then she came back into work, and they said, no, you have to go down to a band 5 now. So imagine that, you've got all those skills, you've done an extra course, and then your reward for that is to go down a grade. It's shocking, but that's going on commonly in the NHS.
What a slap in the face that is. Damo, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to pop in and say public sector workers, they clearly don't do it for the money these days, do they? I mean, you come into these jobs such as a nurse or a doctor or a teacher, whichever public sector worker it might have to be. You do it because it's a vocation. You do it because you want to be, you're inherently a caring person. You inherently want to teach. You inherently want to learn and continue to learn, and you want to be able to share your skills with others. It's not a job. It's not an ordinary job, and it's incredibly demoralizing to see the way that these nurses are being treated. I mean, the one thing that sticks in my mind all the time when we talk about the NHS is the fact that, last year Boris Johnson himself was admitted to hospital with COVID, was gravely ill. Staff there saved his life. Yet you would think something like that would be a life-changing event, that it would flick a switch in your brain, perhaps, to change what you're doing to support that service, to see the real value in it. But it just doesn't seem to be the case. The services continue to be outsourced. Even the procurement of things like PPE continue to be outsourced. And of course, we've seen in the media that the likes of pest control companies have had contracts to supply PPE, for heaven's sake. It's crazy. It's demoralizing. And this 1% pay cut, this 1% pay rise, I should say, is an absolute insult. I mean, I think the Observer came out with a poll today, actually, that said 72% of people think it's too low. So the support is clearly there for people to get behind a move against the government, an argument against what they're trying to pull here, and say, no, this isn't good enough. And I know that there are funds that are being, I think, Royal College of Nursing have got a £35 million fight fund now, which is an incredible amount of money, but it just goes to show how seriously the health services take that. Because if a stand isn't taken, they're going to continue to chip away at the NHS, and they're going to continue to outsource services. And coming back to the comment that was made about travelling distances and the like of that, you guys are in South London, I'm in the west of Cornwall. Cornwall has one major hospital in Truro, and if things were to go from there, I mean, the next major hospital would be Plymouth, and for me, that's a over 100-mile round trip for a hospital visit. That's untenable. That's crackers. It's a crisis, and it's absolutely beyond time now that the general public said, no, this has to stop. We've got to stand with the health services, stand with the NHS. And the NHS workers themselves, if they're not unionised, absolutely need to become unionised, because there's solidarity and collectivism, and together you are many, and you can really take the fight to them then, because you've got power there. I mean, that's all I wanted to come in and say.
Yeah, there's a few, I'd like to come back on a few of the points you made there, because I think they're really important, Damo, So the first thing you said there was about the profession being like a vocation. And certainly as a very young woman, I thought, and I remember being asked on a pre-nursing course, is it a vocation or is it a job? And I remember thinking, no, it's a vocation. I'm going to give my all to this. But increasingly, as I've gone along, I've adopted the view that nurses and health staff need to be treated as workers, actually, because the thinking it's a vocation opens you up to being exploited actually by the employer. So what they'll do, they'll kind of say you should be working your break, you should be doing free overtime because it's a vocation. So they'll erode your rights, your basic rights, like your right to decent pay, your right to your break. So increasingly, as I've gone along, and certainly as a trade union organizer now, I always try to kind of counteract that thinking. And that thinking, particularly among nurses, that they need to sacrifice themselves endlessly. And it's like, no, hang on a minute, you do need to actually look after yourself, because if you're stressed and you're overworked and you're exhausted, you cannot deliver good quality care to patients. You have to look after yourself first. So that's always the point I make, particularly when I'm speaking to nurses. And we need to move away from kind of the nurses are angels kind of rhetoric, and it's like, no, you're workers with rights. You're doing a really critical job for patients over the country, particularly now in the middle of this pandemic. And yeah, you're quite right. I mean, Boris Johnson, his life was saved buy nurses and health staff, but the Tory ideology is very much, they want to privatise and they want to get rid of the NHS. They want to privatise public services, and they're going to pursue that relentlessly. And we've seen it throughout the pandemic. We've seen all the spending, the billions, not millions, the billions that have gone into these private contracts. And you quite rightly said about rent to kill, and these companies with no experience whatsoever taking these contracts. And in the meantime, they're going to turn around and offer our NHS workers 1%. So I don't think anyone's buying into the lie that the money isn't there anymore. And the other thing, that's being done, which I personally really disagree with, is the pitting of workers against unemployed people, because the money is there and there's no excuse whatsoever to drive people into poverty, and not just drive people into poverty, but take their NHS, their social wages away from them too. And we need to make those links really clearly, I think, when we're speaking to people. So yeah, and the outsourced workers, are particularly exploited. And I've spent a lot of my time as an organizer trying to organize them and get them to kind of fight back. So because they're so exploited, they're probably more ready to fight back. So we've had some really good action from them, and we have pushed some things back, because one of the things the private companies are trying to do is cut the cleaning and the quality of the meals in the hospitals. So back in 2019, a private contractor called Mighty was trying to take hours away from workers, which meant that less cleaning would happen in the hospital, and they were trying to get people serving the food to do the meals as well. And you can imagine the risks in that, if somebody's cleaning and then they turn around serving hospital food to vulnerable people. So we fought hard against that, and we actually defeated that plan in St. George's Hospital in Tooting. So where people, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is where people do get unionised and they do step up and be reps and become active, there's so much that we can do within the NHS to protect it, and we can make the demands for pay, for full sick pay, for full wages, that will make some of these contracts untenable and drive them out, actually. So that's part of the work that GMB Union is doing. So I'd say to anybody, join a union, get active. It's really is worth it. Yeah, it is a bit of extra time, and particularly asking busy nurses to do that. I know it's a lot, but what you'll get back in terms of protecting your service, yourself and the patients is 10 times more.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I actually think that the Conservative government have made a huge miscalculation here, because we saw that cynical drive a year ago for every Thursday night you go out and you clap for your carers, and that really brought people on board and make them recognise the hard work that's being done by all of our medical staff, particularly nurses. So to then turn around and give them a slap on the face of a real terms pay cut, people are going to be angry, and people are behind the action that our medical staff, particularly nurses, have to take on this matter. And as a trade unionist myself, it's been quite remarkable. We've seen huge growth in membership of trade unions, and I'm hoping that translates into a lot more solidarity and a lot more bargaining for a fair deal. But I mean, one of the things that we've seen is 37 billion, you touched on the outsourcing, but 37 billion for Dido Harding's failed app, which as far as I'm concerned has failed to deliver. It's a contract. When you buy something, if something's not fit for purpose, you're entitled to your money back. Why aren't we asking for that cash back so that we can reinvest it in the staff that are saving lives every day, hour after hour? And it's long been a case that nurses' shifts are incredibly long, working under pressure, knowing that if you make a single mistake, it could cost somebody life, literally. So under that pressure for prolonged periods of time, and I've heard a lot of reports of nurses that are working long shifts, having to take on additional hours under it's a system called banking. So you put your name forward to try and get awarded some overtime. Surely that's going to lead to mistakes and problems for nurses.
Absolutely, Bonnie, you've hit the nail right in the head there, because exhausted staff do make mistakes. And, right now, the conditions in the NHS across the board are the type of conditions that will mentally and physically break people. So it's very serious. You also spoke about the clapping. What we want to see as a trade union is less platitudes, and we want people to be respected. And that respect will be reflected in their pay, in their terms, in their conditions. And there's another issue in the NHS that I'd like to address just off the back of what you were saying there, Bonnie. And that's the fact that organising needs to take place in the wards and in the communities. Because right now what we're seeing is a lot of reps and staff having to spend a lot of time sitting in front of management bargaining. So they're being pulled heavily into that, which is important work. Don't get me wrong, it's really important work. But I tell you what, when you've got an engaged, active workforce around you and you've got the numbers, you'd be far more powerful in those bargaining meetings with management than when you're without that. And management will always know when the staff are unionised and organised and engaged and when they're not. And they'd be very, very quick when you're trying to organise union meetings in the NHS or meetings in the canteens. They'd be very quick to intervene into that because they see the risk there and they see it far more, you know, the risk there than our own side see the power of it sometimes, you know. And I'm lucky, I suppose, in my life that I've seen the power of collective action and solidarity. I've actually seen it with my own two eyes. I know it works, but I think we need to get that message out there strongly that it does work. And it's particularly powerful in the NHS because I think NHS managers just aren't used to it. They're not used to, you know, work with the workforce all being together. And there's a lot of divide and rule tactics used within the NHS to have kind of nurses and other people pitted against each other, which, and obviously we have to cut across that as well and try and make sure there's solidarity and people look after each other and people stick together. And I'd always say to people, you know, if there's an issue in the NHS about patient safety or whatever else, don't raise it on your own. Make sure you raise it as a collective, and the trade union can help you with that. You know, we can organise collective grievances, etc. So always go to your union. Try and do things as a collective. All of you together in your union is very, very important if you're going to navigate the NHS effectively and get them to listen and take notice and take the issue that you're raising really seriously.
Oh, it's a standard argument, isn't it? Join your union, because on your own you beg, collectively you bargain, and you've got a lot more power if you work together and show the management who are making decisions that are detrimental to your life and to your ability to do your job. You're making those demands, you're more likely to get them if you stood together. It's the bottom line. I mean, on the privatisation of the NHS, in the last week, we've seen news that a particular 99-year-old gentleman was in a private hospital having problems with his heart, it would seem, and he required some surgery. And of course, the first thing that happened, because it was complex surgery for an elderly patient, private hospitals were not in a position to provide that surgery. So he was transferred to an NHS hospital, to a private ring of an NHS hospital, relying on the building, the operating theatre, the NHS trained doctors and nurses to save his life. And while he was being treated there in this private ward, that meant that staff were taken away, essentially, from the NHS patients elsewhere. And then once that surgery was over and the risks were reduced, private hospital were more than happy to have him back in. Surely this is a two-tier system that we're allowing to happen within the NHS. What can we do, the general population, to insist all people are treated equally when they have health needs, and treated by the same doctors and nurses and given the care that they need, not because of a fear of the cost, because of medical decisions that they need that surgery?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've drawn out the point really well there, Bonnie, about privatisation. And the fact is that people seem to think it's a better class of service, but actually it's not. And what private companies do is they'll cherry pick, like you said. So they'll look at your hip replacements and things like that. They'll cherry pick the short treatment, the least expensive aspects of patient care. And anything that's complicated, they won't touch. And basically, if a complication arises, as you've said, if somebody's in surgery or whatever, then they're straight back into the NHS, and what you'll get is that private patient who's paying will of course jump the queue and will take all of the NHS resources, etc. And I think, you know, you can't blame the public really, because people are in pain, they're suffering at home, they're on waiting lists, and they're just desperate, aren't they? So desperate people want to get their issue resolved quickly, so they are taking out probably, you know, the cash out of the credit card to pay for something that they can't actually afford in the first place. So I think there's a real need there to tell people about the impact of privatisation, actually, because I still don't quite think that the public is fully aware of what's happening and how the NHS has just been taken away by stealth almost, slowly. And I'm sure you've been in many of these kind of meetings around Epsom and St Helier that I've been in those same meetings, and you'll know when they're presenting a cut, like the cut that's about to happen in Epsom and St Helier NHS, it's presented in such a complex way, it's so difficult to understand, and it's presented as a good thing, when in fact we know that with the changes that are about to happen in Epsom and St Helier NHS, they're talking about a brand new hospital, but we know that it'll be a much smaller facility, much further away from the population, and we know that all the acute services from 2 local hospitals are going to be moved and merged and concentrated, and there'll be less beds and less staff, and the impact for the staff, our members will be enormous, because they'll have to travel further to work to the new facility. They'll probably be down-banded, the roles will be merged, it'll be huge upheaval for them as well, so they'll suffer, and then the local community as well will suffer, because they'll end up having no A&E department in St Helier. They used to have an A&E there, so they'll end up with a service in Sutton that they won't be able to directly access. So it affects everybody, and I think there's a real need to be out there in our campaigning, which we're trying to do actually around Epsom and St Helier in conjunction with yourselves in COSH. We're trying to just explain things simply so people understand the impact of privatisation, because unfortunately the NHS is one of those things, when it's taken away and you turn around, it's not there anymore. It'll be gone before we realise it, and then that's when people miss it, I think.
I mean, it's a massive job of education for people. Obviously, we're facing that where we are now. You mentioned Epsom and St Helier. Yeah. The exact same plans are existing across the whole of England, and we're going to see this repeated time after time. I mean, in that particular case, the co-location of an acute facility with Royal Marsden raises enormous flags for me. We're dealing with a pandemic, a highly contagious virus is killing people, and the plan is to put those critically ill patients, highly infectious patients, on the same site as people receiving chemotherapy and everything else. And, at a time of pandemic, surely this is an illustration why this is such a bad idea. And also there's an issue, particularly in this case, because Marsden obviously is a world-renowned cancer hospital, but they're actually at the limit of the amount of income they can make from private patients. So my fear is as well, once the facility is moved, if they get away with letting it happen, we're going to see doctors and nurses that should be looking after NHS cancer patients drawn to look after critically ill patients in the acute unit, and then going back to the cancer patients. There's a chance as well that the Marsden, and they've mentioned it, may be looking at switching to a fully private model, because they've maxed out how much money they can make from private patients. Further they go down that line, makes me wonder, will those acute facilities actually still be available to NHS patients? Because already they're putting restrictions in, and who's going to be able to access them? Oh, like I say, it's going to happen across the whole of England. We've got to stand together and make a stand on that here and now.
I mean, one other thing I'd really quickly like to mention is in the NHS white paper that's coming down the line, there's plans to deregulate the professional bodies that we have concerns about. So when I say the professional bodies, I mean bodies like the NMC, the nurses regulator, the doctors regulator. So the Secretary of State is going to get additional powers to abolish regulators, and they're saying that the tasks of regulators could be merged. So what will end up there is a lack of scrutiny, actually. And it will be really, really serious. And I remember certainly when I was a nurse, my NMC code of conduct was a really powerful motivator for me to absolutely do the right thing when it came to patient care. So what you're going to see is a breakdown of that's coming down the line that's really, really serious. So this NHS white paper, there's lots of other things in it too that are going to be really concerning, that are going to advance the privatisation agenda. It's going to advance the drop in standards in the NHS. So we need to be really clear about that and putting that information in the public domain as well. So it's really, really important. I just wanted to raise that in this call. And it's going to have implications. They're talking about, we've seen the nurses build up huge solidarity, for example, in this NHS Pay 15 campaign like never before. Obviously, if they change what a nurse is or means, it's going to break down all that solidarity completely. So there's really serious implications going forward with these plans in the NHS white paper for the NHS.
So the public are behind the nurses. Obviously, this pay cut is worse than an insult. It's putting nurses, the people who save lives every minute of every day in our hospitals of our loved ones, of our families. It's putting them under pressure to work hours that they shouldn't have to work just to be able to afford to put food on their table. And mistakes are going to get made that could perhaps be avoidable if nurses are having to take on additional shifts, which is where we are. At the start of the pandemic, I remember there was a massive call out for nurses who hadn't completed their training, were allowed to fast track their, being signed off, go and work on the wards to look after COVID patients. And then by the time we got to last summer, they were told, oh, there's no job for you now. Like you've worked double hard, you've made the effort, you've faced the sacrifice, you've walked into the wards where the patients are dying in front of you, and now you haven't got a job, which just seems to me absolutely ridiculous. And of course, what we're looking at as well is nurses who have had bursary removed, so they're financially punished while they're training. And with the rollout of tuition fees and the increased cost of tuition fees as well, we're going to have a crisis of recruitment of new young nurses coming into the profession, aren't we?
So, that's thank you for raising that, because when I was a student nurse many years ago, I actually got paid a wage, and then it was replaced with the bursary, and students were made supernumerary at that point. So that means they're not part of the numbers. They shouldn't be doing any tasks because they're there in a training capacity. And what's happening during this pandemic is there's such a desperation for staff that now student nurses, like you say, are being co-opted in to work on the wards, do some of the heavy work. Some of them are even on the intensive care units where the most unwell patients are. And definitely in at least one hospital that I know of, you've got student nurses in the intensive care unit taking all the risks of catching COVID, doing all that heavy work, and they're not getting paid. They're not getting paid a band 4. So what they're doing is they're doing all this heavy work. They're accumulating student debt as a thank you for that, which is absolutely disgraceful. So we're back to the days of the exploitation of student nurses again, which for me is a really sad thing to see, actually. So that's one of the things. And they're saying that a lot of people have signed on to do student nurse training because they've been inspired by sort of some of the stuff that's going on TV and stuff that they've seen during the pandemic. But I tell you what, it takes a lot for a student nurse to get through a new course, and we've got a third of them dropping out of the course at the moment. That's how difficult it is because of the like you said, the bursary being taken away and just the conditions that they're having to endure at the moment. So we're in a situation where we're trying to fill up a leaking bucket. The bucket is leaking, the staff are going, we're trying to fill it up, and they're saying, the government are trying to make out that this is the solution to the recruitment crisis, and it most certainly isn't. And in fact, what we're going to see is an acceleration of the drain of experienced staff out of the NHS, which is a risk for patients. And that's the link we need to make there, because this whole argument about the 1%, it's not just an argument about pay, it's an argument about standards, and it's an argument about retaining the experienced staff in the NHS, which is so important for patients and for the public. So we need to make that point loud and clear there,
At the end of the day, the patients are the people that rely on the nurses, and if the nurses are tired or not fully trained, that's a massive leap of faith. And also student nurses to be going into debt to study, being forced to work for free. There's a word for that, and I'm not very comfortable with it in the 2020s. It's just not acceptable. These are people that we rely on, deserve to be properly recognised, and that doesn't mean a clap on your doorstep or a pat on the back. That means enough money, pay for your family to eat and for your housing. I would imagine, given the squeeze on pay the last decade or more, do you have any figures for the number of nursing staff that are having to rely on food banks?
I don't have any exact statistics, but I can tell you that the numbers are rising up, particularly at band 5 level. The numbers are rising and nurses are struggling. We're coming up to International Women's Day, and so many of these nurses are young women with children trying to survive on a nurse's salary. So right there, they're struggling and they're suffering with their pay, and they can't afford, with one nurse I remember on social media recently, I know her quite well, and she was saying that her son was looking in the cupboard and said, "Oh, please, mummy, can you do some food shopping soon?" And she had to wait till a few days till payday before she gets some food in for the child. You know, that's the situation that nurses are facing at the moment. And that's why so many are leaving, because like I said to you, they're highly educated. Many of them have degrees, PhDs, masters, and they're, you know, they're questioning why, you know, when they've done all this study, they've all these years of experience, their pay, they haven't got enough pay to live on. It's so unjust. And what we want as a trade union is we want pay justice in the NHS across the board. You know, we can see that the outsourced workers, the porters, the cleaners, the caterers are being exploited as well. So we want pay justice across the NHS and across the bandings, because things aren't right at the moment. And it does feel, well, it is the case that it's just been deliberately driven into the floor to advance the privatisation agenda, because that's what we're going to see. We'll see services failing because the staff are just fed up, they're leaving. Services will fail, then that's an excuse for private companies to come to the rescue, quote unquote, which of course they won't. They'll asset strip everything even further, and it'll have huge implications for patient care going forward, and for care being free at the point of need. And what we're seeing as well is like senior NHS managers saying they're going to start reimagining services, which is quite a frightening word. And what they're talking about there is the advance of digital medicine. So the use of Zoom, the use of like digital platforms. And I tell you what, you know, as an ex-nurse, you need to be able to see patients sometimes to tell that they're unwell. You need to be able to look at that person in front of you. You need to be able to touch their skin. There's things like that that you cannot do over a Zoom call. So that will increase the risk to patients, and it's going to make it far, far harder for doctors and nurses to assess people properly. The challenges are going to be enormous.
Yeah.
So there's a concerning direction of travel that, you know, that's worrying me, you know, with the NHS. And I'm really...
we're seeing ever more of this digitization of healthcare, aren't we? I mean, certainly through this pandemic, I know that my GP surgery are unable to offer you any form of appointment for at least 3 weeks. And when you do get an appointment, it's generally over the phone, and they might say, if you've got something that's visible, text us a photograph. That isn't caring for somebody, and need to recognize, I mean, mortality rate is beginning to drop. People are not reaching the ages that they were reaching just 10 years ago. And we're seeing a lot of sort of comorbidities and complex health issues, which you can't phone up the doctor and say, I'm feeling a bit iffy because I've got a bellyache or something like that anymore. We're looking at a number of overlapping conditions that may need further investigation, and it's expecting an awful lot of our medical staff to be able to hear from your voice what's going on with the rest of your body. So, and I'm concerned as well about the integrity of the data that's being shared, because on the London Underground you see lots of adverts for GP services that you can sign up and get support and get a telephone consultation, what have you. And I think people are signing up to that without realizing that that means that they are deregistered their regular GP practice, and all of their medical records are going over to a private company. And we've seen time and again data sharing issues as well on the NHS, which, you know, obviously if you're in hospital, the people looking after you need to understand your background and what your history is. That information being collated potentially to be bundled off to an insurance-based system is deeply concerning to me as a patient.
Absolutely. And, you know, another point I'd like to make is I used to work in a busy casualty department when I first qualified as a nurse. And this false narrative was developed during, you know, after that period, that people abuse A&E, and it's simply not true. And what I used to see when I worked in A&E was a safe system, actually. The public all knew to go to A&E if there was something wrong with them, and they were very quickly triaged. I used to do it myself, and they were put in categories. They had the treatment they needed, and it was safe. It was safe for people. And now what this narrative built that people were abused and it's not true. And what we used to see was some very vulnerable people actually turning up, you know, with mental health problems, etc. And to me, that was a sign, and it was a sign that there wasn't other services available for them. So they'd turn up to A&E as a last resort to get the help, and we try and help them as best we could. So, you know, we're seeing the erosion of the A&Es now. Like I said, you can't turn up there directly anymore, and it's becoming very unsafe, actually. And what we'll see is an increase of people being unable to access anything, because the A&E is one of the gateways into the whole NHS. So you'll see people, basically the doors, it's like the gates being closed via the GP, which is the other key point of access, and the A&E, and people are just going to be left, and there'll be an increase in deaths and the development of more chronic health conditions, because we all know if you don't treat something quickly, you know, it'll get worse. Any mental or physical health condition will get worse if it's not treated in a timely way. So in the long run, it'll cost the NHS, what's left to the NHS, even more to treat people, you know. So it's yeah, it's all very worrying, like I said, the direction of travel, really.
It truly is. I mean, I hope anyone watching this programme do take 5 or 10 minutes, have a look at what's happened to the NHS provision where they live and see the galloping rate of privatisation within it. It looks like we're heading towards a perfect storm where nurses can't afford to carry on working for the money they're paid. Nurses don't nurse, have an extravagant lifestyle. Nurses nurse because they care, but they should also understand that they're going to be able to pay the bills at the end of each month. And at the moment, that's not happening. And nurses are going to agencies to take on additional work, and the agencies are making a profit from providing that stuff. This is such a false economy. Look, if nurses are not there to look after people, you're going to need more doctors to pick up care, as you said, with things aren't treated effectively and quickly, things are going to get, people's health conditions are going to get worse. So it's a massive false economy, and we've seen it time and time again. But the bottom line is, I suspect it's not about saving the NHS money. It is about bundling it up small parcels to hand off to friends with companies that might not even be involved in healthcare provision. So it's really something we need to stand firm against. The general public are behind the nurses. We're behind all of the unions. Get involved in your union, join a union, stand as a rep, take action, defend your pay. We're with you. Thank you very much for every single thing you do. And thank you very much for coming on the show today, Helen and Damo.